Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to this History and Public Policy / Cold War International History Project afternoon seminar. It's great to see several familiar faces and some new faces. So welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome back to the center to this session on Stalin and Togliatti, Italy, and the origins of the Cold War. Launching Elena Agarossi's and Viktor Zaslavsky's book with the same title here today, published, of course, by the Wilson Center Press and Stanford University Press last year. Let me recognize, where is he? He was just here a minute ago. There he is, Joe. Joe Brindley, the director of the Wilson Center Press, who bears major responsibility that for this book. Of course, several others around the table here have also been involved. It is a great pleasure to welcome to the center, not to welcome back to the center as a former fellow, but really somebody who has not been to this building even. So to welcome to the center Professor Elena Agarossi, co-author with Viktor Zaslavsky of this book. Let me just say it's just been wonderful to have had her around for a few days here in Washington, and it's just a real pleasure to have you here, Elena. She is professor of contemporary history at the, I'm going to butcher this, Scuola Superiore di Pubblica Amministrazione in Rome, and a member of the Wilson Center. Well, she's a Wilson Center alumna. She has taught as professor of contemporary history and history of international relations in various universities in Italy. Her research has focused on the history of political parties, Italian foreign policy, and international relations. She had a lot of awards and distinctions and fellowships to her credit. We'll be here all evening if I start listing them all. Let me just say that she is very prolific, has been publishing a number of new books, and aside from Stalin and Togliatti, she's of course well known for her work on World War II, on A Nation Collapses, and on Operation Sunrise, The Secret Surrender, and she's just come out with a new book on the Western Allies and the Balkans in Italian so far. Unfortunately, I understand, so hopefully we'll see an English language edition of this at some point. Elena, it's congratulations on what is really a terrifically important book, a landmark study, not just in terms of the source space that is built upon. You'll be, I think, talking about that in a moment. It's also a landmark study in terms of the historiography generally and certainly within the Italian political context, and my hope is that you'll also talk a little bit about this. Congratulations on this accomplishment. Obviously, this is a bittersweet occasion for all of us because, of course, we had hoped that Viktor would be here to launch this book with us back in 2007, 2008, when we first discussed this publication, the possibility of publishing what already is a major Italian standard work on the subject in English through the Cold War International History Project series here at the Center. And as many of you know, Viktor passed away and could not see the fruits of his labor coming to fruition here. He is, for all of those who know him, I don't know how many of you have known him personally, but not only was he one of the leading intellectuals and historians and political sociologists of our time, not only was he a important figure in the Italian Academy, and in many ways the International Academy. He's won awards, including the Hannah Arendt Award in Germany for political thought, known for many of his important books, including on the Katyn massacre, but also through a number of articles, journal articles that have really that made him one of the leading intellectuals and scholars of our time. Not only was he that, he was also just a wonderful human being, one that I owe personally a lot to. So this is also in memorial to Victor here. We have the distinct privilege to have two of this country's leading Cold Warriors or Cold War historians to comment and to help us launch this landmark study. Who goes first, Mark or Vlad? Vlad, okay. Vlad Zubok really doesn't need an introduction to this group. He is a senior scholar with the Cold War International History Project here, an off and on fellow, resident, grantee, awardee of the Wilson Center. Every couple of years he somehow manages to get one of these grants and is back, which is a delight for all of us. He is, of course, professor of history at Temple University. Prior to that, he worked and led the Russian projects at the National Security Archive. Build up the East Bloc archival documents database there, a joint database of new Russian materials that the Cold War Project and the National Security Archive established some years ago. He is, of course, a prolific author, including books, most famously, of course, Inside the Kremlin's Cold War with Konstantin Pleshakov, and also A Failed Empire, the Soviet Union and the Cold War, from Stalin to Gorbachev. But he's also worked on Russian anti-Americanism and Russian intellectual cultural history. It's great, as always, to have you back, Vlad, and I think we will have you back this fall here in residence, so that's great. Mark Kramer also is a major fixture on the Cold War sky. Doesn't need an introduction here either. He's the director of the Cold War Studies program at Harvard University, a fellow at the Davis Center at Harvard. He has a long list of fellowships, most notably perhaps a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford. To his credit, a long list of publications with ranging from the 1968 crisis in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring, all the way to civil-military relations and institutional change after communism, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the crisis in the communist world, 1956, and the list goes on. He, of course, is the editor of the Journal of Cold War Studies, one of the leading journals in the field. So, we have the privilege of two terrific commentators. And there's the editor of the Center's Cold War Project book series, Jim Hirschberg. Welcome, Jim. With that, I've spoken already too long. Let me turn it over initially to Elena for some remarks, and then to Vlad and Mark for comments. And then I hope we can quickly get into a discussion with all of you before we then adjourn and continue the conversation over a glass of wine outside. So, welcome, everybody. Elena, wonderful to have you here. Congratulations. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really, Christian, for all your kind words for me and for Victor's memory. And I thank, obviously, the Center for Buddhist International Center that I was here so many years ago that better not to say when, how many. And thank you also, I can have the opportunity to thank Joe Brindley for really helping me to publish this book, and to Herzberg for the very nice introduction to the book. So I will start with an episode which is reported in our book. It's an exchange between Italian writer Ignazio Silone, then a communist, a member of the Communist Party, and the Italian leader Palmiro Togliatti. Silone expressed his worry that the Soviet archives would ever open. Italian communists would be held responsible for the misdeeds of the Soviet Communist Party. And Togliatti reassured Silone, saying that when it comes to truly serious matters, Soviet comrades never put anything in writing. He was also convinced that a true communist does not keep a diary, and he never did. And he told all the communist leaders of the party not to write. And in fact, they obeyed his orders. Yet he was wrong, obviously, in both instances. Despite abundant self-censorship, Dimitr's diary is the paradigmatic example of a revealing communist diary, and the documentation in the Soviet archives, even if it was not written to be read by scholars, was opened by the sudden collapse of the Soviet Union. And so it was kind of miracle for all of us that were not open this event. A part of the archives, in fact, revealed was gradually open, obviously not very much, but at least an important part gave rich documentation that has brought about a revolution not only in Soviet history, but also in world history and the history of the international communist movement. And then, in turn, impacted in a great number of national history, including Italy. In the early 1990s, Victor Zaslavsky and I were the first scholar to get access to the Soviet Foreign Ministry archives regarding Italy. We were interested in the relations between the Italian Communist Party and the Soviet Union in the period from the Second World War to the death of Stalin. This access was not easy, but the support of the Feltrinelli Foundation, which was organizing an international conference, opened the doors of the archives. So we first wrote a conference paper and then expanded in a book, was published in 1997. And then a new and large edition was published 10 years later in 2007. In that period, new documentation not on the Italian case, but on the Stalin relations with the Yugoslav and Greek communist parties were open. And 2 years later, we prepared this revised edition, English edition, which tried to explain to an American public the importance of the Italian case for the history of the Cold War, set the party history in the context of Stalinist international strategy. In fact, the Cold War, the impact on Europe in general, has never been really truly assessed. We also discussed and probably mentioned the early polarization of Italian politics as one of the consequences of the confrontation between the two systems in this bipolar post-World War. Our book, so very clear, it was not intended as another of the many histories of the PCI, but to treat this specific neglected aspect, the relations of the PCI with the Soviet Union. Without the archives, we would never have written this book. And in fact, before, but why it was important, the opening of the archives? Because until then, there was no reliable documentation of the PC-Soviet relations. Even the party archives in Rome, there was this all concerning relations of the Communist Party with the Soviet Union. All the archives, just to note, all the archives of the PCI were sent to Moscow in the 50s, and they were returned after the fall of the communism. but still there was no mentioning of their relations. Until then, the history of the PCI, mostly written by party historians, was based on a series of myths, the most important being the presentation of the PCI as a national party that continued to evolve towards ever greater autonomy from the Soviet Union. So the PCI in the international literature has been considered as an exception in the international communist movement as a party, reformist, democratic party that played a decisive role in the establishment of democracy in Italy, and also obviously got also quite an authority on the question of the as a promoter of the Eurocommunism later on. So any interference with the Soviet Union was flatly denied. This was the interpretation dominant in the historiography proposed by such party historians like Paolo Spriano, who wrote 5 volumes of book on the Communist Party, which was a reference for Italian history book, for Italian university. And so this was the interpretation which was accepted by the majority of the historians. There were others that stressed instead the influence of the Soviet Union in the politics of the PCI and the Italian political life, but there was no documentation, so it is only an indirect indication. So let us briefly describe, for people are not very familiar, the Italian situation after the fall of fascism in 1943. Italy was the country on the border between the two camps. The presence of the Allied armies on the Italian territory, which fought for 2 years an Italian campaign against German occupiers starting from July 1943, assured Italy assignment to the Western camp. This was never contested. On the other hand, the presence of in what immediately became the most important communist party in Western Europe. Between 45 and 47, Communist Party reached 2 million of members. And so it was really the most organized, well-organized party in Italy, and its generous support by the Soviet Union and the activism of Tito Yugoslavia opened the possibility that of post-war left-wing victory, the ballot box. 2 other circumstances strengthened the PCI hand. The party was led by an intelligent and charismatic leader, Palmiro Togliatti, perhaps the most intelligent of the communist leaders in Europe. Togliatti led the PCI from 1926, when it was a very small party, clandestine, and until his death in 1964, and at which point he left a well-organized mass party controlling a powerful trade union. He had spent most of the fascist period in Moscow, interrupted by important missions in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and he survived all the Stalin's purges to return to Italy in 1944. Another important advantage for the PCI was a strict alliance with the Italian Socialist Party, which, unlike in France, was pro-Soviet and eager for a share of the generous Soviet financing. The left-wing bloc was at the peak of its influence from 1945 to 1947 due to the important role played by the communist-led partisan movement and the general shift towards the left that was common to Europe in those years. In the first post-war election of 1946, the Communist and the Social Party together reached 40% of the vote. So the possibility of victory was enhanced by the moderate stance pursued by the PCI, and so Italy became in some way in that period, the battleground of the two opposing great powers, with the Americans supporting the Christian Democrats, the Catholic Party, and the Soviets supporting the left-wing bloc. The Italians chose the former with the great majority of the votes, also for the propaganda campaign promising American aid through the Marshall Plan in a completely ravaged country, ravaged by the war and by the two occupations. But this success of the electoral vote of April 48 has obscured the preceding months when a civil war was considered very likely by both sides, and both sides prepared for this event. National Security Council wrote a big important paper on this Italian situation in the autumn as a first paper in the autumn 47. So Italy was seen as in some way leading a possibility of the expansion by legal means of the Soviet Union influence. So coming back to our book, it is clear why it was important to know which role the Soviet Union had played. We didn't expect to find such a trove of rich documentation in the Soviet archives, but we did. The various archives we consulted, the most important sources were the papers of the Soviet embassy in Italy, archived in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This document painted a completely different picture for the one dominant in the Italian historiography. Nearly every day, the Soviet ambassador recorded a conversation with leading figures of the PCI who came to ask for advice or report news of the government action, even inside the government procedures or actions. The Soviet ambassador also sent political letters, they are called political letters, to his superiors in Moscow, appraising the Italian situation. So for the first time, we had a first-hand, uncensored evidence of the PCI subservience to Moscow from a trustworthy source from within the Soviet hierarchy. I think it is just a dream of every historian. It should also emphasize that this period of access was very brief. At a certain point, the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were closed again. So what the archives revealed was that the PCI leaders considered themselves part of the Stalinist elite, shared a common political culture with the rest of the international communist movement, and they considered part of our people. They called our people, I mean, nostra gente in Italian. So there was a kind of difference between the two countries. One were Italian, but at the same time felt as part of the communist world and obedient to the Soviet Union. The Communist Party occupied the perch in a strict hierarchical ladder, descending from the Soviet Union down through various degrees of authority. So obviously, besides the Soviet Union, there was also the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, which had earned a higher status by virtue of a successful struggling against the Nazi occupiers. So what is new and different? Just to make some examples. Perhaps the most important one is the big battle again on the decision by the PCI to participate in the conservative government led by the ex-fascist Badoglio, and as soon as Togliatti went back to Italy in March 44. To convince, especially to convince all of the other anti-fascist parties to follow suit. This is called the Svolta di Salerno, from the town where the government was housed. So this was always considered a Togliatti initiative, and Togliatti was credited with creating a coalition government that then guided Italy until 1947. Instead, the Soviet documentation, in particular the Dimitrov diary, reveals that the Salerno shift was imposed by Stalin, overruling the written opinion of Togliatti, which was against Badoglio because he was an ex-fascist. And this was written in an entry on the eve of an encounter between Togliatti, Molotov, and Stalin on the eve of Togliatti return to Italy in March 1944. The Salerno shift was part, in fact, of the Stalin policy of a national front. Nothing really strange about it, because also there is this very well-known article by Mark, Revolution by Degrees, Stalin's National Front Strategy for Europe. So it is documented that even Stalin wanted the National Front even for Yugoslavia at the time as a part of his policy, but was instead a shock for the Italian, historiography. So in fact, in order to show that this was his initiative and connected with the recognition of the Badoglio government that was decreed by Stalin during the same period, Togliatti falsified the date of his departure from the Soviet Union with claiming that he left 2 weeks earlier than he really did. This falsification was accepted by all historians until the real date of this departure was acknowledged in Dimitrov diary. The second question important is the question of Trieste. That is, Togliatti accepted Tito's request to annex Trieste and Istria to Yugoslavia. Policy was this acceptance was always denied by the communist historians, but the Soviet documentation is very clear. And so in the case of Trieste, Italian national interest conflicted very heavily with those of the Yugoslavia, which stood higher in the communist hierarchy, as we said. And Togliatti had no choice but to give up. But certainly this inflicted a fatal blow to the communist pretense that they represented a national party. Finally, the decision not to resort to an insurrection after the election of 1948 is another case. This possibility was considered quite likely, as you said, by the US government and was expected to provoke a civil war and possible a breakup of Italy. The Kennan hypothesized that Italy would be divided between north that would be taken by leftist forces and the south that would be remain to the Italian government. In this case, the Soviet archives are also quite revealing. They document a personal request by Togliatti to Stalin for instruction in March 1948 during a secret meeting with the Soviet ambassador. Stalin cautioned against any insurrectional initiative and recommended that the PCI keep a low profile in order to avoid a possible confrontation with Allied armies. It's probable also that Togliatti was really tried to, given his request, is also suggested that instead an insurrection would provoke a much more general insurrection, so it would have been more, it was not suggested, but in any case it was obviously favoring a quiet and more tranquil stance on the part of the Communist Party. More generally, in any case, from this correspondence, from all the papers that we could see, the enemy is from the beginning the Catholic Party, the Church, the United States. These are all the reactionary forces, what they call. All the correspondence is characterized by anti-capitalist and anti-Western feelings which have persisted until today. But it's interesting to note that they were there before the Cold War started. So the two camps were already in place. So while this new evidence is significant for Italian history, it's also relevant for a clear picture of the origins of the Cold War. The section of the book devoted to the Stalin's Mediterranean strategy, including his cautious policy towards Greece, a very clear example of Stalin's theory on the correlation of forces and the first signs of his impatience with Yugoslav territorial ambitions. So generally our book, we ask for some comment on the reception of the book, was well positively received by most major journals, but it was also criticized by the scholars partial to the traditional interpretation of the PCI. Some of our conclusion, notably regarding the Svolte di Salerno, that had always been a linchpin of the official PCI historiography, were met with considerable resistance on the part of historians, notably in particular Aldo Agosti, who actually published here the translation of his biography by Togliatti. And we was convinced before this evidence came out that it was Togliatti who had convinced Stalin of supporting Badoglio. The second Italian edition of our book contained, in fact, a short chapter including all the polemics that the book had provoked, but obviously we skipped it in the English edition. But it is, in any case, is an expression of the still polarization of Italian historiography. Perhaps it's changed in these last 10 years, that we hoped would dissipate with the end of the Cold War. Nonetheless, the same polarization can be seen also in the recent debate in H. Diplo, where some of our critics chose to ignore our focus on the Soviet relation with the PCI in favor of criticizing our supposed lack of consideration of the internal debates within the PCI, or denying our assertion on the strong influence of the party in Italian cultural life. Scholars of my generation are the children of the Cold War. This, to quote a recent paper by Charles Meyer, we all bring in our writings what we went through in the 50s and the 60s. So I perhaps certainly some pages of our book are unconsciously polemical, but we try to base our arguments on the existing documentation. I must confess to feeling fatigued by the need to continue fighting the old battles. Circling back to the exchange between Silone and Togliatti, contrary to Togliatti's expectation, the archives revealed their secret, at least a part of them. A lot has changed in the historiography and the political climate, yet Togliatti is still considered il migliore, the best, untainted by his Stalinism that he so strongly supported. He supported the 56 intervention in Hungary. This is one case in which he wrote a strong letter when instead the Soviet leader was thinking to give up and to accept. So we can only hope that sooner or later his followers and the admirers will have to take into account what the Soviet archives have exposed. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Elena. Let me, I was remiss in acknowledging two people here I should have acknowledged, and there are lots of people around the table I could acknowledge, including one of this country's leading historians of Eastern Europe, Charles. But let me recognize two people since I recognized Joe from the center. Sam Wells, our former associate director, and who had probably something to do, I suspect, with Elena, your being here in 1974. So since there are few people that go back that far to, I do want to acknowledge Sam's contribution and presence here. And then, of course, Professor Alexander Zaslavsky, who resembles his father disorientingly from this perspective. So, Sasha, welcome as well. So, with that,
all right.
Vlad, over to you.
All right. Okay. I can only say it's a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces and be in this uniquely stimulating environment in Washington, D.C. And all my greetings to Charles and Sam, and of course Jim out there. Tired by the struggle over another monster manuscript. For me, as I was listening to Elena, it brought back all kinds of memories as we discussed this manuscript for years, because when I was one of the persons who discussed it, even with Joe Brinley, and of course with Victor, and raised all kinds of questions. And I think it's wonderful that you, Elena, you represent a generation that went through the Cold War, because frankly, if we forget what the Cold War was about, all the passions and fears that were associated with it, even I got a little bit of that during the 80s, then we'll be at the mercy of quantifiers in political science who would just quantify the whole thing and come to conclusion that it didn't make any sense. Anyway, for me, it was wonderful to talk to Victor and Elena about this book, and I pushed them hard to explain to all of us who did not live in Italy who was this Togliatti, and how he managed to survive living all these years in the USSR, and why we cannot even today to read any comprehensible biography of Togliatti, his life in the Soviet Union. Of course, as I talked to Elena and Victor, I understood that the guy was uniquely secretive. On the picture, he looks very, very refined and intellectual, but he was quite a Bolshevik, as we found out gradually about him. So my little talk would be about this book as talking to different audiences. It talks, of course, to the Italian audience, and as Elena described, it talks very powerfully, forcing those historians who prefer to remain stakeholders in the bankrupt interpretations to somehow accept the facts, to face the facts at least. But also the book talks to other historians and other audiences, and I represent one of these audiences, Cold War, of course, historiography. And for me, the book was extremely interesting from the viewpoint of how Stalin, working with people like Togliatti, and for instance, Togliatti specifically managed to develop and implement a strategy, Soviet strategy, between, let's say, 1944 and 1949. The period that was the period of maximum flux, and when the division of Europe still was in the process of making. We, from the documents that presented in this wonderful book, from other documents that keep coming out of various archives, not only Russian archives, but Eastern European and others, we do see this signal, the signs, the shadows, the echoes of Stalin as a strategist. But it's surprisingly hard to reconstruct Stalin's strategy on the basis of direct evidence, even though we have a lot of his evidence. So what was Stalin's strategy? It cannot be said that Stalin had a specific strategy for the Mediterranean. However, having read this book, I think I agree with the authors that while the Mediterranean occupied an important part in Stalin's strategy, Italy was not. Italy was not. In fact, I would like to dwell on the two episodes that are very salient in the book, where one can see how Italy thrust itself upon Stalin, literally forcing Stalin to make some choices, to make some decisions concerning, of course, Italy very powerfully, but also, in a sense, reflecting Stalin's strategic decisions. And, of course, the first such episode, as Elena mentioned, is the Svolta di Salerno. I mean, why, indeed, Stalin met with first Togliatti, and then later on with Torres, and why he took that decision. On one hand, you can indeed explain it sufficiently by the usual tactics of national fronts, popular fronts, masking Stalin's intention to bring communists to power, to use communists as a tool in achieving foreign policy goals. But here I want to pose on the table the question, what were his policy goals? What was his strategy? What for and how he wanted to use communist parties and communist leaders as Soviet tools. And here we have, of course, other sources that tell us that throughout 1944 and, let's say, Yalta period, leading to the Yalta summit, Stalin played a very delicate and interesting game dealing with, of course, with Churchill and Roosevelt. And at some point, the book cites at length a wonderful document when Churchill came to Moscow for the Tolstoy negotiations in October 1944. And Churchill, as most of people remember, wanted to make a deal with Stalin. We take Greece, and you take, parts of Eastern Europe, and bargain about Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. But here, Elena and Victor reminded us that Italy was also mentioned. Churchill came basically to try to strike a bargain with Stalin to prevent the Soviets, or he called them the Russians, from getting into the Mediterranean. Although during the talks, he, of course, said the opposite. Of course, we will be happy if the Soviet Navy would in the future appear in the Mediterranean. Stalin said, sure. Well, of course, nobody, they didn't believe each other, obviously, in what they were saying. But Italy was mentioned by Churchill specifically in this context as, we don't want to have trouble in Italy. We don't want to have disorder in Italy where the Allied forces are stationed. And Comrade Stalin responded, and I would like to quote, this is at length. He responds, he finds it difficult to influence the Italian communists because he does not know the internal situation in Italy. Moreover, there are no Soviet troops in Italy, which is true, the only true thing about this quotation. So we cannot order the communists around as we can in Bulgaria. If Comrade Stalin were to begin giving orders to Ercole, the latter would tell him to go to hell. The only thing Comrade Stalin can say is that Ercole is a wise man who will steer clear of any adventures. Well, you here have Stalin basically playing the game he loved to play during 1944-45, saying, I cannot influence Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists. I cannot, in Manchuria, I cannot influence the Italians. They are the masters of their house. But that's sort of saying in a strange way what almost prophetically what would happen. Indeed, Ercole turned out to be a wise man from 1944 to 1948 at least, who steered clear of any adventures, indeed, but with a little bit of Stalin's help. So another thing that, of course, is interesting in this context of Stalin's strategy in 1944 and the Yalta period of 1945 comes out of the diary of Ivan Maisky, who, relatively recently became known to all of us. And Maisky was responsible at the Yalta summit for reparations, and he took it very seriously. He prepared all the numbers about huge Soviet losses on the part of the Germans, so he hoped that Stalin would insist on high reparation numbers for the Soviet Union, and Stalin was not even interested in all that. He took a casual glance at the numbers, and then disheartened Maisky learned from Molotov that Comrade Stalin actually wants to lower the number of Soviet reparations. Why? What for? Soviet people suffered so terribly because Comrade Stalin does not want to scare the Allies. On the contrary, he wants to get them interested. So you give more reparations. He tells Churchill, and of course Roosevelt doesn't need it, but you can take more reparations. They're not so interested. From this and other evidence sprinkled in the book, and of course not only in the book, in the larger historiography, one can say that in 1944 and 45, Stalin did not want to scare Churchill and wanted to get Roosevelt interested. There's a slight nuance in this approach to the two countries and the two leaders. He did not want to scare Great Britain, and he wanted to attract the United States. That is very important, and that continued, I think, throughout Yalta period. What did Italy have to do with all this? The authors, Victor and Ellen, completely justifiably said that Italy was not on Stalin's priority list in 1944. Yet, his instructions to Togliatti that led to the Volta di Salerno, you may argue, killed several birds. They got the communists inserted into the provisional government after all. They also, as Stalin at least expected, presented the communists in such an unusually moderate way that could only have attracted Americans and did not scare Churchill. Churchill was scared despite that, and Ellen and Victor write that this particular move concerned Churchill quite a great deal, and he went actually to negotiate about it to Stalin in October. But it shows at least how Stalin combines strategic goals, which implied at that time the preservation of the big three at any cost, with tactical moves that could ensure his future position in Italy without antagonizing his allies, without jeopardizing bigger stakes and bigger game in the future. The second, of course, remarkable episode that Ellen already mentioned in her talk is, of course, March 1948, on the eve of the Italian elections, that nobody could predict how these elections would turn out. And in general, this particular Italian unpredictability and uncertainty was magnified by huge uncertainty that was looming in the entire Europe. The results of the Marshall Plan, although in existence, was still unclear, unknown. In March, of course, 48, infamously, the communists seized power in Czechoslovakia. And you may argue that the drastic turn in the Comintern parties who were members of the Cominform since September 1947 led to all kinds of factional strife that, of course, Togliatti was very much aware of. And this is the strength of the book, that Togliatti, still an enigmatic figure, is shown as a very skillful politician, thinking about the extreme left wing, extreme left faction, represented by guys like Secchia in the Italian Communist Party. And, of course, we all know from the records that Secchia went to Moscow. He went to Moscow, not Togliatti. He met Zhdanov and Stalin in December 1947, and he returned to Italy literally with a sack of money, a sack filled with US dollars. So in this situation, Togliatti, seeing a possible rival within his own party, deftly preempts him addressing Stalin through Soviet ambassador and almost forcing Stalin at this point to give an answer. What the book clearly says, that Stalin had no time for Italy. Stalin had no time for Italy. Again, Italy is at the bottom of Stalin's priorities at the end of 47, in the spring of 48. As bad as it may look for Italians, I would say they were lucky. To be lower on Stalin's list of priorities is a sign of luck for me. Nevertheless, Togliatti forced Stalin by addressing him through the ambassador with a request. In a calm, measured manner, Togliatti asked me, Kostev writes to Moscow, Togliatti's language and how he coaches his requests to his friends in Moscow. Whether in case of one or more provocations from the Christian Democrats in Italy or other reactionaries, the democratic forces should initiate an armed insurrection in order to seize power. And he immediately adds caveat. That's why I want a book on Togliatti in Moscow, spending all these years seeing how the purges decimated the Comintern, how the purges decimated the communists who surrounded him. He learned quite a few things about how Stalin's mind operated and how communist politics operated. So he adds a caveat to that, and the telegram says, Togliatti also noted that if the Popular Front forces were to resort to armed action, communists, that is, the result could be a great war. And the word is a great war, of course, it's intentional. It's to alert Stalin. That's the big, big question worthy of Stalin's attention. And this great war, of course, involving countries outside Europe with Yugoslavia and other newly democratic countries weighing in on the side of the Popular Front. So, indeed, immediately this cable reached Stalin's eyes. So, again, Togliatti's apparatchik skills worked perfectly. This got to Stalin's table, and the answer immediately came on March 26. Molotov telegraphed Kostev the response of the Kremlin to Togliatti's inquiry. The Soviets counseled an armed response only in the case of a direct attack on PC headquarters and its representatives. That was the end of the episodes. That, you may say, it was maybe not the last, because we may not know, but it was the last decisive Stalin's intervention, sealing in one way or another the fate of Italy. In general, I would like to congratulate Elena and of course, Victor for achieving this coup, because getting cables like this from the Soviet archives remains a task next to impossible to this day. I don't know why, but this is the fact. And we can see how these cables change the whole situation, how they make history of this period so much more nuanced and so much more subject to scholarly interpretation. In the end, I know my time is out. I would like to congratulate Elena for seeing this book, reaching all the audiences, many audiences, and we, your friends, are full of joy together with you over this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad. No time for Italy. Mark?
Thank you very much, Christian, and for inviting me to take part here. I knew Victor for many years, and I remember Elena and Victor came to Harvard to see me. I think it was probably about 15 years ago, just after their book had been published in Italy. And we were talking then about someday an English edition. I think they initially were somewhat skeptical about it, thinking that there really wouldn't be an audience. But I'm very glad that they not only proceeded with that, but also went back and revised the Italian edition. And it is substantially revised. That is, anyone who's seen the first edition and then sees the second edition can see that there's a lot more material there. And the English edition is based on the revised Italian, which is very good. I'm especially pleased, though, that it appeared in the series. Joe has left, but is Jim awake? Jim
is awake.
That Jim, as he always does, has a preface in the series, and he mentions that Italy often gets short shrift in surveys of the Cold War. Let me say that in the Journal of Cold War Studies, that has not been the case, that in fact there will soon be review essay by Richard Drake of this book, and quite a long review essay based on the book. Drake has published a few other review essays in the journal previously, and we had a special issue on Italy in the Cold War that dealt with some of these issues, and also a separate article by Sylvia Pons that also looked at focusing a lot on the armed insurrection issue. And actually there was, in that article at least, there was far more common ground, I think, with this book than there might be on some other aspects of the whole question of Italian communism. One of the things that I do want to ask Eleanor about, and I'm going to be posing some questions to her, is how she would, where she sees some of these dividing lines, especially between someone who's a very good historian like Silvio, less so than with some of the other Italian historians who are much more, how should I say, much less nuanced and much less sophisticated. Let me, one of the things I do like about the book is the portrait that it has of Togliatti, which Vlad has picked up on as well. It is interesting to, and I think they make a very persuasive case that Togliatti's time in Moscow, a very grim time, had an effect. I do hope that Charles Gotti will speak up during the discussion period, because his book focusing on, among other figures, Imre Nagy, who went through a very similar experience, yet ended up quite different, even starting in 1953, but certainly by October, November of 1956. Yet a lot of, you can see a lot of those same instincts, I think, in Imre Nagy, who they just went in a different direction in Togliatti, and it's interesting to compare the two of them, I think. Part of it, of course, was that the party was in power in Hungary, and so that made a difference. But there were other elements that I'd like to come back to during the discussion. Another figure to think about here would be František Kriegel, who again had, I'll explain who he was since I know the name's not familiar to most people, but he went through very similar experiences. He became one of the leading, in fact, the most radical of the Czechoslovak reformers in 1968. Kriegel was on the Presidium in Czechoslovakia and was far more of a bold departure in challenging the Soviet Union in particular. He had lived, again, all during these years in the 1930s in Moscow, and had served in the Comintern and had fought in Spain and so forth. Well, actually not fought, he was a medical doctor. But in any event, so he ended up very different from Togliatti, at least by 1968. Even earlier, though, you can see some of that. Alexander Dubček, as well, had spent many years in Moscow, although not the same years. He was there earlier. And so, again, you can look at these people, at least the ones who were there during the terror, which wasn't true of Dubček, but the ones who were there during the terror and seeing different paths. So one of the things I do want to ask Elena about is why Togliatti ended up in the way he did. That is, basically subordinate, unquestioningly subordinate. Well, maybe a few questions, but generally subordinate. They make a very powerful case in the book, I think, that the whole handling of the Comintern in the 1930s, that there'd been a bit of autonomy on the part of the Comintern, at least until 1936. You can see this, especially in 1935, but by 1936, as the purges are beginning, and then as the Comintern itself becomes a target of those purges, as well as what people were witnessing around them, with suddenly senior party figures being accused of being English or Japanese spies or other things of that sort, where suddenly it became very dangerous to dissent even slightly, and the impact that had on Togliatti. You can definitely see that, but why didn't it have, say, quite that same decisive impact on some others, at least more lasting impact? Let me also just say quickly about, because this has already come up both in Elena's comments and in Vlad's. There's in some ways, the chapter that I found most riveting in the book was the one on the armed insurrection. And here, I think, again, in looking at some of the archives in Moscow, I think there are a few things that have emerged since the revised edition was completed that shed a bit more light on this. One of them is in the Molotov-Lichny Fund, which a lot of which is now available at Rogusby, the former Central Party archive. And in there are files mostly from cables from Suslov to Molotov, but pertaining to Greece and Italy. And these were mostly from late 1947, but also a few from early 1948. And some of these, and again, this is discussed in the book, but the link with Greece, I think, is particularly interesting. There was as everyone knows, there was an active civil war underway in Greece. And Stalin went back and forth about how to handle this. And again, here's the link drawn with Yugoslavia. By Victor and by Elena and Victor is very sound in my view. But Tito was far more determined to support the communists in Greece in seizing power. Which again was it wasn't the major thing, but it was an irritant certainly in his relationship with Stalin. And the whole question, though, of how to deal with Greece loomed against the background of the March 1948 elections. And that is brought out a bit more in some of these cables from Suslov to Molotov. And similarly, the question of Yugoslavia, although by then the major issue was over how to deal in the Balkans, and specifically with Albania, which has been discussed at very great length by Leonid Gibiansky, including a new book that has come out, a very thick book about Yugoslavia. And in his chapter in there, he too discusses the link that comes up in Elena's and Victor's book about Yugoslavia. So in that sense, there was, as Vlad mentioned, that there wasn't a Mediterranean strategy per se, but you can see the southern European link that those three countries at least did have a lot of impact on each other as they affected Stalin's policy toward them. It wasn't a coherent strategy, but events in one country did tend to affect Stalin's policy toward the others. Then let me finally say a bit about this. Goes beyond the time frame of the Stalin-Togliatti relationship, but it is discussed in the book. So let me just bring it up quickly, which has to do with Hungary in 1956. This is discussed only because, again, the book focuses mostly on the Stalin period. But there, back in the mid-1990s, I think it was at a conference sponsored by the Cold War International History Project, cable came to light that Arjun Khairy had provided that is a cable showing that Togliatti had contacted or sent an urgent message to the Soviet Presidium on the 30th of October, warning that counter-revolution was underway in Hungary and urging a decisive response. Now that event, as they point out in the book, was very important because on the 30th of October, the Soviet Presidium, unknown to certainly to Togliatti, was deciding to refrain from military intervention in Hungary, and basically, at least tentatively, it was a tentative decision to let Hungary go its own way. That decision was reversed the next day, and as Elena and Victor point out, Togliatti received a cable that next day assuring him that in fact the Soviet Union largely agreed with his characterization and would be taking measures to deal with it. Now that day the Soviet Union had reversed that decision, and so they write in the book that the message from Togliatti may have contributed to the Presidium's change of mind, and that it must. Wait a second. And then a bit later they write that it must have had some impact, which I think is a very cautious, appropriately cautious way to put it, and I would agree with. Certainly that it was one of numerous factors. I don't think it was decisive, but in fact, I think ultimately what was decisive was what was going on in Hungary. But it clearly was important in the sense of being among numerous factors that were all pushing in the same direction, which was to reverse the situation and reverse the decision of 30 October, and to essentially clamp down in Hungary. So it is. I think they're appropriately measured in their judgment about that. It is interesting to think about Togliatti's view in 1956, and again think to another leader with whom his fate was often linked, even a very different fate, was Tito. Tito, too, despite, again, being in a very different situation from Togliatti, Tito, too, strongly supported the invasion. He didn't write on the 30th of October. He expressed his support when Khrushchev came to Belgrade, or to Brioni, and met with him. But still, they, despite their great differences, ended up with the same position, that it was counter-revolution underway in Hungary. And of course, Mao Zedong accepted that view later as well. Not later, but after initially having held out hope that events might move in the right direction in Hungary. So the questions I have for Elena, and I'll end on this, I promise, Christian, is first of all, can you explain why Togliatti ended up in the position he did as compared to some other figures who were there in Moscow during the terror, including those involved in the Comintern like Imre Nagy, and why he ended up in the situation he did, where basically an unquestioning servant of Stalin. And you do point to some factors in the book, but I'd like you to bring these out more. And similarly, with regard to the armed insurrection in 1948, the whole question of Greece, if you could just say a bit more about that, because in the book it's brought out, but I'd like you to think about it even a bit more. And then, well, I'll end on those questions.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for your very thoughtful comments. The advantage or the risk of having Mark Kramer at these panels is that not only will you get a review of the English language Togliatti volume, but also of the two Italian versions, and if there was a Russian and a Hungarian and a Czech version, you would also have those all wrapped into one review. So, Mark, thank you. I want to give Elena a chance to engage with some of the comments by Vlad and Mark, but I also like to, since we're quickly running out of time here, invite some of you for comments, and Charles has already been called upon to make a grand comparison to Imre Nagy, but others are welcome as well, yes. if you could wait, please, for the microphone, and then we'll go around the table, start here, and work our way around the table. I'll give you a moment to think about this. Well, yes.
Hi, Eddie Becker, and I worked on a book a long time ago about U.S. policy towards Italy, probably beginning with the first declassification in 74 to 76, when the 1947, 48, well, 48 and 49 came out, before many of the documents had been withdrawn since then. And I remember seeing in some of the documents, there was, I guess, an early on agreement that anyone who participated fighting fascism, fighting the Nazis, would eventually get their self-determination, the four freedoms. And I think that was underlying the thoughts of that there would be elections and everyone would run and they would have sort of an election, and that was the way it was supposed to go. So then coming up, of course, to the 48 elections, one thing that the National Security Council had released was their document on what to do in the event that the Italian Communist Party won the elections through legal means. And there were a whole bunch of things, and of course there were some things still deleted. And then later on it comes out that, there were stay-behind groups and some other things that were ready to have some sort of insurrection should the Italian Communist Party come to power through elections. Maybe even wet operations. There was an attempted assassination on Togliatti in 49, and I was wondering what you saw in the Russian documents about who they thought attempted that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We'll go Charles and then Yep, right behind you. Sure.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I will be very brief. 2 points about the Hungarian angle, and then I have a question. I don't know if Togliatti and Noid knew each other in Moscow. They probably did, because I think they both lived in the Lux Hotel, where all these Comintern types were packed and ready to go as soon as the NKVD showed up. And so they served the cause even as they were packed with a suitcase at the door in case the call came to be taken away. It's an extraordinary circumstance. I kind of wish that somebody would write a book about the Lux Hotel in the mid-1930s. It had to be quite a place. The second thing about 1956 was that Togliatti, I agree with Mark on every. I don't think that foreign influences were substantial. When communists were on lampposts in Budapest, the Soviet embassy in Budapest was frantic and reported that Andropov reported that communists were dying, and under these circumstances, and that more than anything else, determined the Soviet reaction. What the Chinese said, I think, was just, or what Togliatti said, I don't think made that much difference. It probably reinforced the decision they were ready to make anyway. But the November 30 letter did upset some of the people there. I know specifically one of them, Renaud's press secretary, who spoke fluent Vásárhelyi, who spoke fluent Italian, and he, I think, mistakenly had hopes that Togliatti was an anti-Stalinist and would be supportive of this quote-unquote socialist revolution. So they were upset by it, but I think they understood that it did not make the ultimate difference. Now, my question, I have not yet read your book, and I'm very excited about reading it. I have a question about 1947. And the question is the following. If the Italian party was as subservient to the Soviet Union as it appears that you are describing, even though I have not yet read it, now how come at the Cominform meeting in September of 47, I think Vlad made a reference to that in the Polish town of Szklarska Poręba, how come Zhdanov went after both the Italian and the French parties. By implication, some others there as well. And I even remember, I don't know why I remember these stupid things, but I do remember that he used the phrase parliamentary pirouetting, which is to say that these parties were going about their way the parliamentary way. Well, I suppose the alternative is insurgency, which by then, late 47, the Soviet parties, Zhdanov and Stalin, on whose behalf he spoke, must have advocated. So the Soviet party line suddenly changed, and so they were charged with parliamentary pirouetting. Well, I think under those circumstances, that was practically revisionism. And I think that would show that even though Togliatti wasn't there, I guess Longo was there for the Italian party. But he must have been speaking, or did maybe not, for Togliatti, and he was defending himself and very upset. I even have a picture. Somebody who was there described the scene that he sat in a park, apparently a little guy, Longo, and that he was sitting on a bench, and his feet did not reach the earth. And he was sitting there, and just his feet were moving. It was a very dramatic picture that somebody described for me. He didn't know what to do with himself because he had not expected to be criticized. So maybe the Italians were a little different, were they not?
Thank you.
I just wanted to pile on to the question that Mark raised. I did some research many years ago, at the Feltrinelli Institute on the PCI and its relations with the Comintern, and got into the Tosca archives and that sort of arcania. And it was fascinating to me to try and figure out what made Togliatti turn into what he turned into, because you had a guy who in 1927 with Salone was opposing Stalin, who wanted to condemn a paper by Trotsky, Sight Unseen. And Togliatti and Salone said, well, you shouldn't really do that until we can all read it. And, of course, Stalin said, well, then I withdraw it. And, of course, then he had it approved after they left. But then the next year, you had Tosca being told by Togliatti, Bukharin is the guy, is the brightest one of the group. He's the one who really understands the complexities of the situation. So here you have a Bukharinite evolved then by 1929, when Bukharin was totally, a sad and defeated man, as they described him, and then was ousted. You have Togliatti apparently concluding that you really got to, that as I think Humbert Droz said, he concluded that success was more important than truth. And so I wonder if that was sort of Togliatti's evolution, because he was obviously, was a very bright guy, but he did figure that it was good to be on the winning side and to stay on the winning side. I just appreciate comments on his evolution, which I think is fascinating.
Thank you. Elena?
Yeah, many questions, and please remind me if I forget to answer something. So, starting with Mark, first question was about Silvio Pon's historiography, and we are similar in the sense, because also Silvio has looked on the papers and the archives and knows very well, but he's also director of the Gramsci Foundation, and so it means that he couldn't accept source volte di Salerno. So this is a clear example that he kept saying, and also in the H. Diplo discussion, that Togliatti and Stalin agreed, discussed and agreed. But this is not true, because Togliatti had written something was completely different. So they couldn't agree. Stalin said, no, this is not a way, do that, and that's it. So, but this is actually Silvio is always trying to, he's an historian and a politician. This is what happens in Italy. So, but the real question, the important question about Togliatti, attitude, why didn't evolve I mean, towards democracy, you mean, in a sense. I think that Togliatti was always been a Stalinist. I mean, in his core. So it's also, I think, doesn't correspond to what we wrote, the fact he was a servant of Stalin. We don't say so. We say that he obeyed Stalin. It's difference. I mean, he was a very powerful figure in Italy. I think it was the second most powerful figure. And I answer in some way your question. I mean, in Italy, he had great success. He was the leader of a big communist party, and so he had big power on the trade union. So he shared in some way the power with the Catholic, and so but still he was always thinking that he never find a criticism of Stalin in all his work, and actually he was against Khrushchev 20th century, discussion and the criticism. He thought it was not, was better not to say all these things. I mean, he always very secretive and didn't always very cautious at the same time. He was a realist, I think, as a person. And so, but he wanted to have the status quo. He didn't like the idea why he would insist on writing this letter in '56, because that would mean a big change, and he didn't like that. On the other hand, he refused to be the secretary of the Comintern when Stalin offered him. He hated the idea to go back to the Soviet Union and be a secretary. He was there's some notes about his relief when he finally was able to leave London, leave Moscow after 2 months being there, and his letter to Stalin saying that he would be much more useful for the communist movement in Italy than in Moscow, and his comrades were very happy to get rid of. Yes, but I think he went through the Lux Hotel experience. I think between 40 and 41 he was very criticized even by his attitude towards Gramsci. So it was not an easy position in the last of this memoir of the secretary of Togliatti at the time. Obviously it was. And also the Dimitrov diaries shows that he was not one of the leaders that were consulted. He was just put at the side. So he thought that finally he went to Italy. He was a powerful leader, and that is what I think he was wanted. And only the last period, there are some historians who show that he was, becoming much more open, the idea of Euro-communism. So, but there is really still a lot to study about Togliatti, because even this famous last in '64 in Rialta document is very ambiguous. You don't exactly know why he was against Khrushchev. It's possible. This Argentieri thesis, or was instead because he was leading organizing this international conference, is still not clear. So, but he certainly was not democratic. This is, he was not interested in and he was not a revolutionary. Also, he was a Stalinist, I think. So this on the question of the attempted assassination. It was in '48. I don't think it was organized by anybody. Never came out. And there's nothing on the Soviet archive that we could see, but it was just individual who did it. And instead, on the Comintern conference, I said. I never said that Togliatti was was a servant in the sense that he had a great autonomy in Italy. And he liked the idea to be part of the government, and and this was what Stalin had told him to do. So he was at the same time obedient, but also being, in a sense, an important politician. So between 44 and 47, he did a very moderate policy, actually much more moderate than the Socialist Party. The question is that I think that he didn't go to the conference because he probably thought that something was changing. Because at that point, there was starting the day of Marshall Plan. There was this difference in the situation. And in fact, what happened is that he sent Longo. But Longo couldn't only excuse himself, saying, we did what was natural to do, but we will change. So as soon as Longo came back to Italy, there were some strikes. They did some movement. But at the same time, when Torres went to Moscow again, and he complained, because they were, both of them, Torres, the PCI and the PCF were treated very badly by Zanom, saying that they were not revolutionary, they were just parliamentary parties. But in fact, this is what Stalin had asked them to do, to be part of the government. So Torres, it was very nice that he went to speak with Stalin and said, but what I did wrong. And he said, don't worry, you didn't do nothing wrong. It's just don't really, no. This was Stalin. At the same time, when Stalin, so the idea of a big, revolutionary party for Italy was, in fact, was never there. Togliatti was thinking the possibility of getting power, but just by legal means. And in fact, when also Stalin, Secchia, instead of the revolutionary in the party, went to Stalin in December and asked what we do, and he said, Stalin answered, Togliatti is very good, just stay there. But when he came back, this is typical of Stalin, Secchia had to be nominated the vice secretary. So it was like, say, okay, you are good, but there is somebody there looking, controlling you. So it's, and also, I think this is a part of the Stalin strategy against the Communist Party. Nobody could be safe. So if as actually an addition to answer to Mark, if he tried to do something different, there was someone, especially in the first period, the Stalin period, that would have taken his place. So that would have meant losing power for him. So no, there is something else. What was the other questions? Did I answer?
I think you answered most of them. Any other questions?
There is some specific question that I forgot.
Final quick question, realizing that you're between us and the reception.
Just a question about the money transfers from the Soviets to the Italians. Is there in the documents a specific justification or request from the PCI or an explanation by the Soviets about the money as to why it is needed? Is it to offset American money that is pouring in on behalf of the Christian Democrats, or is there anything in the documents specifically justifying the money transfers?
No, the money was transferred in many ways. In the first period, even selling fur. This was fur, yes, and it was. It's just in. We didn't understand when at a certain point it was written in a document, furs are not accepted any longer, and we couldn't understand what that means. So finally we understood that it was dangerous to see, could appear to the customs and so on, to have this fur coming back and forth. So to to Sekia, as Vlad remembered, there was given just money in a sack. But this, in the case of in the beginning, it was just given like that, and then it was institutionalized. And there are documents, very precise documents of how much money was given to various communist parties. So the beginning was French Communist Party got more, and immediately after it started to be the Italian Communist Party, and then the Italian Communist Party got the major part. And all the other Communist Party, from Albania to, all the other Communist Party of Europe were getting, and also the Socialist Party of Italy. And but this money arrived in Italy until 89. So it was only and some part arrived also after that, because Cossiga, that is a very extremist politician of the Communist Party, got his part of money even when they stopped stopped to give it to the official Communist Party. So, and it was given not for upset American money, and also, everybody speaks about American money, but they were parallel. It was one given the other one, but they were given to just for newspaper, for everything, for organizing the section. And the American knew, because there is in the American documents the fact that they say, the Communist Party is great, there's no problem of finance, and they didn't. And the only thing a moment I forgot about the 56 letter of that was not. I think too that was not important, but I would ask Gatti why. I think that the real important thing was the Suez control, because otherwise how can you explain that on the 30th they decided not to intervene, and the 31st they decided to intervene? What happened in one day?
I can answer.
All right.
You did answer that.
The greatest risk of all is to call on my predecessor, Jim Hirschberg, when we're well past the time. So, Jim, for a very short question.
Very short. And in the spirit of our esteemed colleague Chun Jen, who has been at many Cold War conferences with many of us, who always manages to work into his comment that every panel is a point of departure for future research. I would just wonder for Elena, so Mark and Vlad and others will know, is there one document that you were not able to get from the Russian archives that you most wished you could get about this story that Vlad and Mark and others can keep looking for as they return to Moscow?
Think about that for 30 seconds. Final, very 10 seconds. Yes.
I interviewed Jules Humbert-Droz in Switzerland many years ago, and I asked him what his role was, and he said he used to bring money strapped to his chest. He was the Comintern courier, and that was a fairly primitive way of doing it.
Up in Switzerland.
Thank you.
To be noted.
Eleanor, one document?
One document. I don't even know.
I have an easy candidate, the Stalin-Togliatti conversation.
No, there is, in fact, there is another conversation, Stalin-Togliatti, that is 49, and on 70th birthday of Stalin. But also, you see, they play it's the same game. I have the impression that they're playing the same game, in the sense that Togliatti, who didn't want a revolution in Italy, asked Stalin, should we do something more? I don't remember exactly the term he mentioned. So, can we force the situation? He didn't want to force the situation, but he showed to Stalin that he was ready to. This is very typical. So, I don't know. I would like to know a little more about, not their relation, I think it's very clear, about what really Togliatti thought. That is still a mystery, but I don't know if you can find it in the archives.
I would very quickly add, I'd also like to see, Jim, the discussion in the Soviet Politburo of Kostelev's, the ambassador to Kostelev's cables, because we know what was in the cables, but at least the ones that are available, but we don't know the discussion.
Excellent. Before I completely lose control of this panel,
Oh, yeah.
let me
yes,
thank
Marcel.
Elena and congratulate her on this remarkable accomplishment. Vlad and Mark, thank you for your comments. Thanks to all of you for joining us, for joining the discussion, and I'd like to invite all of you, after a round of applause for our panelists, to a little reception outside where we can continue the good conversation. Thank you.